the extremists were very smart. I mean, when they were figuring out how to get to everyone, they couldn't do it with race. And by golly, I mean, when you start attacking people's identities, specifically gender identities and their sexualities, you get everybody in that basket.
Give me just a second to set that up. While I'm doing that, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and give us your name and pronouns and kind of what you do with Honesty for Ohio Education, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Cynthia Peeples, and I'm the founding director of Honesty for Ohio Education. And Honesty is a nonpartisan statewide coalition that works to ensure that every student receives an honest, high-quality education that's grounded in truth, facts, and diverse perspectives. We also work to ensure that the identities, cultures, and lived experiences of all students and educators are affirmed and celebrated in the classroom. And finally, probably one of the most important things that we do is work to ensure that our education leaders are prioritizing the rights and safety of all students, families, and all of our educators and staff across Ohio.
All right, excellent. I wanted to say thank you, by the way, for coming on so much. I know it was somewhat short notice, so we really do appreciate it. I'm not sure quite how many people are watching right now. I try not to look at it too much because it kind of influences the way that I do things. But usually we run about like 20 to 25 people per stream. So, you've got a decent sized audience here. We have people from all kinds of demographics. I managed to pull in a lot of trans people from my last speech back at the last meeting. So, we have a lot of people who will be influenced by resolutions like the one that Brennan Shea's proposing and the one that they'll be voting on Tuesday. So, if you'd like to say just a little bit about like what this resolution is and like what it entails, I know that it has to do with the Title IX federal code for inclusivity. So, would you like to say anything about that real quick?
Yeah, sure. What I'd love to do is I can tell you what the current resolution on the table does, and then I'd love to walk through the history of how we actually got here, because this is, maybe the 7th iteration of the original resolution that was introduced back in September. So this has been a long fight, and this resolution has gone through several amendments. So as it stands right now, the current resolution that will be voted on Tuesday of next week is called the Resolution to Oppose the Proposed Changes to Title IX and to Affirm Parental Rights and Control of Ohio K-12 Education. So it's a mouthful, and it's a mouthful because it actually does a lot of harmful things for Ohio public education students. And really, even beyond what happens in the classroom and in the districts, it really sets the tone and endorses transphobia, homophobia, and discrimination, even outside of the school. It really kind of gives permission for people to behave in very hateful and dangerous ways. So the nuts and bolts of this resolution is it defines gender identity as biological sex. So it really, it denies the existence of our transgender, gender diverse, and intersex students. It also does not recognize that federal anti-discrimination protections that are based on sex actually extend to gender identity and sexuality. And pulling that thread a little bit, what it does is it opposes Title IX anti-discrimination protections for LGBTQ plus students. The authors and the proponents of this resolution, they say that Title IX in its original form, when it was originally implemented back in 1972, that originally it only applied to females in school athletics, and that those protections did not extend to LGBTQ plus students. But we know that Title IX has since expanded and evolved to include LGBTQ plus students. And with that expansion, the U.S. Department of Education also has very specific agency guidance to direct any school that receives federal funding as to how they need to comply with Title IX federal protections for our LGBTQ plus students. And this resolution, it rejects how the Department of Education is essentially giving guidance to school districts as to how to comply and comport with federal Title IX protections. So the resolution itself says that it disagrees with the U.S. Department of Education. The thing is, even if you pull the Department of Education's guidance off the table, school districts still have to comply with federal law, specifically with Title IX federal law. And then the state board's objections to the Department of Education guidance, it also gives specific things that the state superintendent needs to do if this resolution is adopted. So if this resolution is adopted, the state superintendent is required to send a letter to all of the public school districts across Ohio saying that the state board opposes the U.S. Department of Education's guidance about how to comply with Title IX federal law. It also says that it sides with our attorney general, who joined 21 other attorney generals across the country in filing a lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Agriculture, because the U.S. Department of Agriculture has a rule that it will not provide federal nutrition funding to school districts that are not complying with Title IX federal anti-discrimination protections. So 22 attorneys generals across the country are filing a lawsuit against the Department of Agriculture for forcing schools to comply with anti-discrimination laws. Yeah, so it sent out that letter to all of the school districts, essentially telling them that they do not, because the state board does not agree with and will not comply with those Title IX protections, that the school districts do not need to either. So it's essentially endorsing discrimination against our LGBTQ plus students. And the important thing to note about this version of the resolution is this is the watered down version, if you can imagine that. And this is the original resolution was introduced by board member Brendan Shea back in September. There was a lot of tug and pull, a lot of amendments and resolutions that were offered afterwards because Brendan Shea's original resolution was completely unhinged and lawless. Legal attorneys were in a lot of discussions with several of the state board members, just the legal jeopardy that it was exposing, the state of Ohio to, let alone the local districts, if they comported with the original resolution. This is the ultimate watered down version that board members, honestly, it was one of the grossest things that I've seen in public education, is to watch elected and appointed state board of education members fighting over whose discriminatory resolution was going to make it to the voting agenda.
Honestly, I would say I can't imagine it, but given the current, kind of culture war nonsense that we've seen so much of in the past year, I can see that happening. As far as you mentioned the federal, what is it? The agricultural State Department. What is it? Sorry, what's the name of it?
Agriculture.
Yeah, the Department of Agriculture. So they're not going to provide funding for schools for food, right? If they're not in compliance with Title IX. And so you said that states are suing them for that, or at least attempting to. So it sounds like to at least kind of try to put a positive light on this, there are more steps beyond just saying we're not going to follow the Title IX restrictions that these legislators and these school board officials have to take in order for these to actually take effect. Is that correct?
Yes. And jumping back to Brendan Shea's original resolution, he had a couple of backstops that he put into his resolution, knowing that districts would be financially penalized nutritional funding if they did not comply with, again, federal anti-discrimination laws. He was directing our General Assembly, the state of Ohio, to provide stopgap funding to the districts that were penalized for violating federal anti-discrimination laws. So essentially, he was telling our General Assembly to redirect taxpayer money to fund districts that were penalized for violating federal law.
Great. Our tax dollars weren't, they weren't being used ineffectively enough. So that's fantastic. But anyway, so I guess my next question would be, with all of the, what do I want to ask next? With all of the like recent activity we've seen, quite frankly, terrorist activity, especially in Columbus, right? We had one in Ohio, in Columbus, where the school board meeting and where the, I know on Tuesday there's another meeting at the State Department taking place, where those were at. And it strikes me as odd that these really don't seem to be being addressed by our officials. Like they just seem to be turning a blind eye to it while still trying to push this legislation. And I personally fear that if this were to pass, even if they do have these extra hoops to jump through, it's only going to make this situation worse with these attacks. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I completely agree with you. Just the mere fact that people are watching this public spectacle of the board members even considering it, the fact that this resolution was even on the table at all in September and was given any kind of life is again empowering. I would say, and I'm not going to use, I'm not a legal expert, but I would say these domestic terrorists and these people that are really levying hate crimes on the LGBTQ plus community. Just the mere discussion of this is empowering folks to attack and discriminate and endorsing violence. It's allowing people to say the quiet parts out loud. Whether it's the verbal discrimination, whether it's the actual acts of violence that are happening, whether it's the threat of violence, whether it's the intimidation. And we're seeing this at our State Board of Education. We're also seeing it at our State House. We have several anti-LGBTQ plus pending bills in our State House right now. When we look at all of these things individually, it's overwhelming. But when we look at it as a part of a larger package, it's kind of easier to grapple with. A lot of these attacks on public education and on democracy and how we live, they really started back in the summer of 2020. After the very public murder of George Floyd, and America was having a racial reckoning with itself and really coming to terms with what it has and has not done for marginalized communities, specifically the Black community. And in that, there was a massive demand for accountability and for education and information. And what was unique about this specific movement was that it was predominantly white communities that were demanding this accountability and this education and information, because marginalized communities, the community that I live in, I'm Korean American, and my husband and our family, we've been pounding our fists about this for centuries, for decades. However, when it hit the white predominant communities and the white predominant suburban schools, that's when things started to change. And that's when you saw this massive pushback against this demand for information and accountability in school districts. And we saw this rash of censorship bills come out, in school districts, and they were all couched in this manufactured crisis around critical race theory. And, these extremists telling these educators who were trying to educate about current events and trying to connect the dots from our history to how we live right now, and showing how our history continues to inform the contours of how we live right now. These extremists, these people that have a supermajority, specifically in gerrymandered states like Ohio, they had to figure out how to rein in this information that was coming out, because information leads to accountability. Accountability leads to people challenging systems and challenging elected leaders and exposing leaders for what they are and are not doing. So across the country, we saw this wave of censorship bills come out. Sadly, we've seen a lot of them actually be adopted in state houses. We've seen, they come in other forms, in the form of resolutions at state boards of education, like what we have right now. And then we also see it, being infiltrated into local school districts with, extremist local school board members that are, infusing this hate and censorship into their school districts via local policies, because Ohio is a state of local control, which is a double-edged sword, right? We love local control, but we love local control when our elected leaders are using it to protect, affirm, and to advance education for all students, not just the privileged few, but for all students. So, like I said, this originally started by weaponizing race and, couching it in critical race theory. When that didn't get a really good foothold in Ohio, they had to pivot, and they pivoted to weaponizing gender identity and sexuality. And that's kind of where we're living right now. There are more than 300 bills.
I'm here to profit off of it.
Attacking gender identity and LGBTQ plus rights across the country right now. And that was in a very short amount of time. And we have several of those bills sitting in our state house. What's just awful, the collateral damage that is happening and the devastating impact of this is these students and these families are quite literally fighting for their right to exist. Yeah. Fighting for their right to exist in their communities, in their classrooms, where they work. They have to go to the State Board of Education and fight for their existence in front of our elected leaders and at the State House. And when they're reaching out for professional medical care so that they can be their whole selves and their authentic selves, these extremist legislators put out legislation to prevent them from even doing that. And what's so ironic about this is that many of these legislators are, when we talk about the emotional and the psychological trauma that so many of our queer kids are living in right now, a lot of these extremists say, it's because you're messed up. It's because you're confused. And that emotional trauma and that depression and that anxiety is not necessarily self-inflicted. A lot of that comes from the treatment that they endure because of who they are, because they have to deal with discrimination, because they have to force themselves to be in the closet, because they will be brutally attacked for being who they are. So the harm and damage that is happening, especially when we look at the intersectional identities, when we're talking about the LGBTQ plus community, queer issues cross cultural barriers, they cross zip codes, they cross faiths. I mean, queer identity lives everywhere. So this is a multicultural, multi-generational, multi-geographic issue. And the extremists were very smart. I mean, when they were figuring out how to get to everyone, they couldn't do it with race. And by golly, I mean, when you start attacking people's identities, specifically gender identities and their sexualities, you get everybody in that basket.
It is very unfortunate. I mean, like you said, you can just be born gay. You can be born trans. It can just happen. And that doesn't really happen with racial and cultural groups, at least not to nearly the same extent as far as I'm aware. But and that, like you said, it provides that extra reach for these extremist groups to really take hold and hurt as many people as possible. And it's very sad. They're also couching their language, their harm that they're doing in such a comfy language, right? They're calling it the Parents' Rights Bill or the Parents' Rights Act or whatever. It's all about parents' rights. And so part of the thing that, and I'd like to get your thoughts, I guess, on what I'm personally going to speak about tomorrow is I'm going to say, like, I am a strong advocate for parents' rights. You know, I believe in parents' rights to be able to afford groceries and school supplies. I believe in parents' rights to make sure that their children can go to school safely and come home and not in a coffin, which is something that we've seen, unfortunately, a lot of in recent years. You know, I just take such huge issue with this idea that this is all about parents' rights. Parents do not have the right to wrench information out of their sensitive information out of their child and then bludgeon them with it. You know, and it really is sad to see so many parents who just believe that they have this right to do that. So, you know, they're very good at couching the language, is what I'm trying to say. So, I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on that particular element of it.
Yeah. And thank you so much for that question, because the language is so important, right? Words matter.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we talk about these extremists hijacking language and hijacking terminology and really redefining what words actually mean.
Yep.
And the first thing that I would say you're right. I mean, a lot of these bills now, part of the pivot away from critical race theory is moving to this, you know, parental rights and parental bill of rights. And the first thing that we need to clear up is that we're talking about families, not just parents, because we know that it is more than just parents that are raising children. We know that it's grandparents. We know that it's aunties. We know that it's uncles. We know sometimes it's the neighbors.
As an older sibling, it's sometimes siblings.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And so when we're talking about rights, we like to say family rights, not just parent rights, because we know that there's a broader definition when we're talking about students. The other thing that I would say is it isn't about family rights. This is about the right to discriminate. This is about extremists trying to find a vehicle to usher in their discrimination and really trying to cause a distraction from what the real issues around education are, the real issues around what's going on with criminal justice, the real issues around what's happening with the environment, access to high quality healthcare, you know, reproductive justice. So this is really just a distraction. And, you know, the argument for what they're calling parental rights is, whose rights are you arguing for? Because there's certainly, if we want to stay within the framework, you know, their rhetoric around parental rights, I'm a parent of 3 multiracial kids, and they certainly are not protecting my rights for my 3 kids to go to school and not be harassed and not have racial slurs thrown at them, not have memes thrown at them. I mean, we've lived in many predominantly white school districts, and it would take an entire other show, Alec, for me to talk to you about all of the garbage that our family has gone through. So there are some very specific people and very specific ideologies that these bills are protecting, which is why part of our what we like to say is protecting the rights and safety of all students and all families. And we also have to think about the educators and the staff in there as well, because we have queer educators as well. And these bills are pushing them back into the closet as well and causing very hostile, unsafe work environments for our educators and our staff. Because we have these ideologies, you know, floating around in the adults in these school districts as well.
Well, yeah. And my partner is one of them. You know, I call her my girlfriend. She's fine with that. She goes by she, they pronouns. When I talk about them in public, sometimes I'll defer to they to get it across the point that right. My partner is non-binary, because, you know, even though she presents feminine enough that it doesn't really come up that much, it's still important to her. And so I want to respect that. And, you know, and she also, like I said, she's non-binary. So as a non-binary person, that technically puts her in the umbrella of transgender. And I am scared, quite honestly, because like she's the type, you might have saw her earlier. She has red hair right now. She's the type that loves to dye her hair. And I only bring that up because, you see this meme of like the blue-haired SJW, right? The blue-haired Democrat, the screeching liberal, whatever. And you see this ramping up of this rhetoric. It's not just it's not just like gay and trans people who are going to get hurt, which they're primarily going to be the ones who get hurt, but it's going to be others as well. I guess to get a little personal, I had a family member call me one time and talked about how they thought I was indoctrinated by my teachers growing up, and that's why I have the political leanings I do now. I'm like, my partner is a teacher. Like, do you understand what you're saying to me right now? So, it is unfortunate we're going to see people get hurt by this. I feel like, what are your feelings on this? Like, only being a matter of time before, a teacher becomes the victim of, something physically violent or worse.
Alec, that's already happening. So in Ohio, when the first two censorship bills came in, House Bill 322 and 327, they came in back in May of 2021. And the immediate intent of those two bills was to foment distrust of our educators. Your teachers are indoctrinating your student or your kids. They're trying to turn your kid against you, and they're trying to make you feel guilty for what's happened in the past. And we know that's not true. We know that education needs to be comprehensive and needs to have full breadth and full color to it. So it was immediately to cause distrust of our educators, but of our public educators, because in this whole attack on public education, the greater underpinning is to cause this push out from public education into privatized education. And if you look at a lot of the legislators, not just in Ohio, but outside, a lot of the legislators that are like peddling these, whatever you want the name du jour is for these bills, they're all very sympathetic and have, really deep relationships with people that are connected with privatized education. And
very interesting.
Yes. And so, again, stepping back even further, when we look at be afraid of public schools. Public schools are indoctrinating your children. Be afraid of public schools. Look at all of the school shootings. School shootings are so bad, we're left to having to harden our schools and put more weapons into the classroom instead of, smart gun reform and looking at behavioral health issues. There's all of that. But it's to create this fear about what public education is doing and is not doing for your student.
Check Alex Gunther. Why, dude?
To push you out of public education and push you into these funded alternatives to public education. And in Ohio, we've got a lot of different strands. We've got charter schools, we've got ed choice, we've got privatized education. We've got these religious release policies now that are allowing students to leave their classroom to go to get faith-based education and instruction in the middle of the day. What's interesting is there are faith-based organizations that are, shepherding in these religious release policies into school boards. And then we've got some concerning school board members that are adopting these resolutions. So, the greater push is to drive people out of public education. And right now, since those two bills, the first two censorship bills were introduced, the penalties that were associated with some of these bills was so egregious and so extreme that before the bills were even passed, the educators were really afraid that they were already violating tenets of the bill. And the districts, they were looking at, well, shoot, are we in violation? What does this look like? We need to do an audit of all of our classrooms to make sure we're not teaching divisive concepts, because that was a term that was in a lot of these bills. One of the bills, the penalties was if a teacher was found to be indoctrinating their students. For the first penalty, the state would withhold 25% of its public funding. The second penalty would withhold 50% of state funding. The third penalty, they would withhold 100% of
Oh my
state
gosh.
funding. And if you think about these districts that are already woefully underfunded and under-resourced, that there would be no recovery for those school districts if they even just losing a quarter of its funding. And I mean, these are the very draconian ways that, you know, these extremist legislators are trying to control public education. So that just caused this massive, you know, chilling effect on education. And again, before the bill even passed. So, you know, and then that also create, you know, this indoctrination rhetoric started, you know, pushing people into school board meetings and harassing the front office. And a lot of this was actually orchestrated as well, because there were a lot of extremist organizations that are, you know, creating a pipeline and teaching people how to go harass their schools. But yeah, I mean, and then we saw, you know, a lot of violence and a lot of aggression at local school board meetings, attacking our educators. And there were a lot of educators who were doxxed, that were receiving, there were some that I know of that were receiving death threats, that were receiving, you know, threats to their children, that people were contacting the educator's spouse at their place of employment, tracking down their kids. So, and this was happening before right now. I mean, and now things have really, really escalated with this attack on gender identity, because there's already so much fear and ignorance around, you know, the queer community anyway. And these legislators are just feeding on that, you know, feeding on that fear, and just really driving this othering of, you know, gender diverse, gender non-conforming, transgender.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's a really excuse me, my throat's been dry today. That's a really great segue, because I did get a 10-minute warning about 2 minutes ago. So I know that you're also very busy, so I don't want to keep you all night. But if you could give us in like the last 5 or 6 minutes, just a real quick rundown of what people like me, you know, maybe allies or people who are gay or trans or otherwise, and, you know, or have gay and trans family members or friends, what we can do locally to make sure, like if we're in red states, especially like Ohio or like Texas or, you know, other states that are doing these kind of things, what we can do to get involved, what we can do to help out, and, you know, how we can be effectively pushing back against this, I guess.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the easiest things that you can do is immediately you can jump onto our website and join our newsletter. We put out a weekly newsletter that covers everything that's happening at the State House, at the State Board of Education, and in our local school districts. Right now, we're living on these attacks on gender identity, but we will soon be pivoting, you know, for the next wave of hate that comes. Outside of following us, we're a coalition. We represent more than 50 organizations across the state of Ohio, so we catch a lot of orgs. I mean, outside of following us, I highly recommend people get engaged and get involved with, you know, the incredible LGBTQ plus organizations that we have across the state of Ohio, who are working so hard and are just exhausted right now. There's Trans Ohio, there's Equality Ohio, there's Kaleidoscope Youth Center, there's PFLAG, there's GLSEN, there's the LGBTQ plus center in Cleveland, there's the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio, there's Love Boldly. There are so many incredible organizations that are doing this hard work every day. And depending on what you need, they can provide legal service. They can provide legal information if there's some litigation or some civil rights violations. There's also the ACLU of Ohio, of course. Or, you know, you can go to Kaleidoscope Youth Center, where they actually engage young people and they do professional development in school districts to help school districts build their capacity and build their literacy and understanding around issues that are impacting the queer community. Trans Ohio specifically works to provide all kinds of different levels of support and resources to transgender, gender diverse, and non-binary Ohioans. But definitely, depending on what your need is and what your level of engagement is, hit all of those organizations and more. But definitely get involved with the organizations. And if you can't do, actual volunteer work, donate. We're all running on nickels and dimes in all of our spaces, and we all have very lean and mean staffs, and we need fuel to keep the machine going. So many of us I'm up here in Northeast Ohio, and I have to travel back and forth to Columbus to scream at the State Board of Education and to scream at people in the State House. So yeah, definitely get in contact with any of those organizations. When there's an opportunity to testify, please testify. You've been at the state board, you're going to be there, how powerful and impactful those messages are. And it's really important right now that we call in the allies, because the students and the families are exhausted.
Yes.
And they're in danger.
And one other thing I want to mention real quick before you go is I have gotten at least one message from, and I know they know a few other people, from people who can't go. Who went last time and have been receiving harassment. So if, and that's awful. But we need people in Ohio. So, if you are watching this on Twitch, I will be uploading this to YouTube as well, as long as that's fine with you. And if you are watching this on YouTube, we need you as well. If you're in Ohio, if you're in a red state, anywhere that is imposing this kind of legislation, if you fear that they might, go to these school board meetings, go to these city council meetings. I showed up at my local city council meeting and there was nobody there, nobody. And I spoke completely openly about House Bill 151. It appears we have a chatter who knows you in the chat right now.
Okay.
So yes.
Definitely engage the legislators. Yes, exactly. Go to the public meetings. All of the meetings are open to the public, and get on the phone and call these leaders. Also, a phone call, a two-way conversation goes a long way. Emails are great. Harassing people's inboxes is always a good thing, but the two-way conversation, so there's actually a dialogue and an exchange of information, is good. It's always good to get context around why somebody feels the way they do. And then you can kind of pull them out of their hate.
Absolutely. Cynthia, real quick, thank you so much for coming on today. We really appreciate your time, all the insight that you can provide with this, and hopefully this can get people active, get them motivated to get out and, before things get even worse than they are now, to make an effective change in their local communities and maybe even on a broader level in their states and in the country. We really appreciate your time tonight, and we know you're really busy. So keep at it. I'm going to keep doing my thing and help as much as I can.
Oh, thank you so much, Alec. Thanks for the invitation to be here.
Absolutely. It was really fun. You have a great night, okay?
You too. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Hello, Adventure Cam. I know you. Cynthia's a badass. Follow her advice. Yes, absolutely. Hello.
Hi, guys. Sorry, I'm gonna come over here. Sorry, I didn't say hello when I was puttering around in here.
You're fine. You came up for just a minute.
Oh, did I?
Well, because you're a non-binary teacher.
Oh, you meant that. Oh,
yeah.
That's cool. That's okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Ghost.
So yeah.
How did that conversation go? It sounded like it went well.
It was lovely. Cynthia was lovely.
Good.
Yeah. I had her on. She's from I can't remember the name of the website off the top of my head.
Oh,
but
did you tell them I wasn't feeling well?
I did.
Aw, thank you. Thank you, Adrian.
But yeah,
I'll be okay. It's just stress. I have soup.
Okay, good.
I have 2 things of soup. I'm not going to school tomorrow.
Okay. Well, that's a good choice, probably.
Probably, yeah.
All right. Well, go eat your stuff and rest up.
Soup.
All right. Well, if you are watching this on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. Like I said, be sure to follow Cynthia's advice. Get active in your local community. Be sure to click the like button if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you want to see more. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Give me some of those good boy points that YouTube loves for the algorithm. We are monetized now, so it would help a lot. It mean a lot to help me make some extra money and get me out of some credit card debt. So yeah, thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.